So this is a special Seven Insider event, and we're holding this discussion at the intersection of a number of anniversaries. 20 years ago today, on the 9th of September 2001, Ahmed Shah Massoud, a leader of the resistance against the Taliban at the time, was assassinated by suicide bombers in Afghanistan at the instigation of both Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. 2 days later, Al-Qaeda attacked the United States by hijacking commercial aircraft and flying them into the World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon. A little bit later, on the 7th of October, the United States and its allies launched Operation Enduring Freedom with airstrikes against Taliban forces in Afghanistan. As part of the Bush administration's war on terror, as it came to be known, retaliating against those responsible for the 11th of September 2001 terrorist attacks on New York and Washington, this military action began what would become America's longest ever military engagement. US forces and NATO troops remained in Afghanistan even after the 2014 handover of security responsibility to Afghan national forces. And in the last week or so, after the deaths of 47,000 Afghan civilians, 66,000 Afghan police and soldiers, 2,400 US military personnel, 1,100 personnel from allied countries, and an expenditure in excess of more than $2 trillion US, the US and its allies have formally left Afghanistan, and the Taliban has retaken control. Also, 20 years ago this month, the Seven Agency was founded in the days before the terrorist attacks of 11th of September 2001. The first assignment was photographing the aftermath of those attacks in both the US and Afghanistan. In the last 20 years, a number of Seven photographers have reported extensively on the war in Afghanistan, extending the work they did in the 1980s and 1990s prior to American involvement with boots on the ground. In that context, this event has a specific purpose, and it's important to start by understanding what it is not. This is not designed to be an event about recent coverage of Afghanistan by both local and international photographers, and it's not designed to reflect on the future of photography in Afghanistan. Both of those would be worthy topics of detailed reflection. What today's event is designed to do is to undertake a retrospective look at some of the reporting on Afghanistan by some of the Seven photographers who covered the conflicts, and to ask how the work of Seven photographers contributed, for better or worse, to the visual journalism from Afghanistan. So today we're going to be showing work and discussing work by the late Alexandra Bulat, Ron Haviv, Christopher Morris, Seamus Murphy, and Daniel Schwartz. We want to begin with Alexandra's work, and to introduce her and kind of her role, Ron, I wonder if, as one of the founders of Seven, you could provide some context on Alexandra and her work.
Yeah, thank you, David. It's obviously would be a pleasure to speak about Alex, who's one of the, as you said, co-founders of Seven, which, as you said, formed this week. And kind of the impetus for the forming of the agency, starting with the conversations between Gary Knight and John Stanmeyer, leading to basically the seven of us grouping together, was that we had all worked together around the world, but primarily working together in the former Yugoslavia, the bulk of us, and had learned about our strengths and weaknesses as people and photographers, and really got to have the ability to know somebody in very extreme circumstances. And so my relationship with Alex started as well in the former Yugoslavia. And when I think back about Alex as a person, I think that she was, without question, a trailblazer in terms of her gender, but her work and her ideas go much more beyond that. She was an incredibly fierce person, very devoted, very loyal to her stories, very dedicated, willing to always go that extra inch, extra mile, whatever she could do to kind of tell the story, always looking for the stories that needed to be told. And the work that she did in the former Yugoslavia, culminating in her book, as well as her seminal work on women in the Muslim world, as well as work in Indonesia and elsewhere for places like Geographic and Match and Time, were very important bodies of work. And Alex was trained as an artist. She had a painting background, a graphic artist background, and that came across in her imagery. And I think that we were very lucky to have Alex with us as long as we did. She died about 14 years ago this October, but she was incredibly influential on the formation of Seven, and also on the I think on the world of photojournalism itself. And I hope that she remains as an example, not only for young women photographers, but for all photographers, of what you can do when you really have the passion to have impact with your work.
Great, thanks, Ron. So Daniel, you curated a selection of Alex's images, and you're going to talk us through that and then move on to some of your own. Let me bring those up. So Daniel, over to you.
So I never had the privilege to meet Alexandra, and I was honored to have given the opportunity to look at some of her work. The first time I met Alexandra somehow was when a photograph which we will later see opened with a double spread, a story I had been commissioned to do. It was strange. The magazine editor called me in the evening, the day before publication, said, well, you know, there's a little problem. He had to use the photograph of another photographer as an opener. And when I saw it, then I immediately wrote him back and I said, I'm so glad that not another child had to die, so that I also could make a picture which then would provide an opening spread. So that was our first encounter. It's about 16 or 18 pictures. Most of them speak for themselves. I provide the captions, part of the captions which she wrote. Here is just something which I found while doing the research. I did not know that Alexandra had studied art history, but something clearly I saw when I looked at her work more carefully now these days, that comes through. So we can start with the first image. Yeah, that's art history. You know, the Caravaggio painting. I'll talk a little bit later about that. It's pre-9/11, it's 2001, and a child who had died from pneumonia in Herat in an IDP camp being prepared for the burial. Some Taliban are running over to the Northern Alliance in Kunduz about a month after 9/11. Alexandra was famous as one of her quotes that you can photograph war without showing guns. There's a bus in Kabul. This woman just gave birth in Jalalabad in the maternity women's hospital, 2004. This is Women's Day in Mazar-e-Sharif. You already see that women figure prominently in Alexandra's work, which comes to no surprise as we are in a Muslim country. So in the women's hospital, I think I should write the embedded information, because it's an extraordinary example of a captions how we would like to have them. Here is the story as written up by Alexandra. Shahima, 25, set herself on fire 20 days ago. She has just arrived to the hospital, but was first healed at home in Apushtu Sargam, 25 kilometers away from Herat. I was unhappy with my husband's family. There was nothing to make me happy in life. He was nice to me, but his mothers and sisters with whom we live punished me all the time. She had been married for 3 years. Her husband was a teacher, but quit his job because his salary wasn't enough to sustain the family. Shahima's family was in exile in Iran for a long time. It's when she went back to Afghanistan that she married. She's a mother of 2 and denies having her set herself on fire, although according to the doctors, there is no doubt about that. In the end, she'll admit she was feeling very depressed the day this took place. it's because of all these problems with my family-in-law. Anyway, I have to go back to my husband. October 24, Herat, Afghanistan. I think that's as good as you can get with the captions. It shows the respect towards the people which at the end enlive our imagery. Next. The picture on top is a woman for the first time since 20 years where Afghan women are allowed to voting and elect the Afghan president. Below you have an election, a UN election worker who was became victim to a car bomb which was aimed at women traveling to distribute election leaflets. 3 of them died. She survived with severe burning. If you look at this picture, you can see this is a composition which you usually would see in Uffizi in Florence or in some other place. And of course, a photograph which none of us male photographers could have done. Now, this is a composite of 4 images. It shows, of course, a domestic violence poster, basically the illustration of what the woman before said. Below you have Dostum, one of the warlords and criminals to whom the Western Alliance, whom they empowered. On top right, you have sort of an image which shows a CBS reporter sort of basically sort of presenting Western culture while there was a war still going on. I think these 4 pictures show a lot how complicated the situation was and how wrong things were done from the very first day, and also how media played in and how media was used by those who already still had power or just slipped back to power. Can go on. Next. That's the beauty kit of the anchor man, and next to it you have a the journal of a woman who paints or makes a sketch of how much she's suffering at home. So I think this is, if there is a clash of civilization, then it's this, but it's something which could be addressed if done the right way. Now here we have a woman casting on the roof of Altai's office, a French, again it's Alexandra's caption, a French advertisement company established in Kabul for the campaign of the mobile phone network Roshan. The one who will be selected will be posing for a big posters photo shoot that will be hanging in each of Afghanistan's main cities. A French art director working for Altai takes pictures of the model. Mugahan 20 experiences here her first shooting. Again, the top picture, Alexandra's caption, Shafika, 60, mother of 15 children, on her way to Kabul. Shafika lives in Mazar. She suffers of internal stomach pains, but none of Mazar Sharif's doctors seem to be able to treat her. Therefore, she's going to Kabul's hospital by plane, accompanied by one of her sons, with the hope to get a better diagnosis and to receive proper treatment. Here, Shafika, at her arrival in Kabul, walks on the tarmac of Kabul airport. Her son carries their only luggage. The picture below speaks for itself. Yes, now that's sort of the picture which actually would precede our opening picture. Now, what can we see? What can we take away from Alexandra's photos first? Because I'd try to speak a little bit more on that. They exposed the Western, I think, cultural re-education project in Afghanistan, camouflaged as a humanitarian intervention, fatally intertwined with war of different nature, peace enforcing and reconstruction, all of which combined had to fail. They expose a criminal naivety of Western alliance, in my view, which instilled onto people locked in then already 20 years of war Occidental values without preparing and stabilizing the conditions in which such imported values could be assimilated within the cultures of a multi-ethnic nation and without confronting the prevailing traditions and while not delivering what is needed. So how should we regard this image? Of what does it speak? It speaks of a tangible tenderness. Of course, it is an image weighed down with sadness and trauma, an image of what parents should never, ever have to do. There is nothing shocking, I think, about the image, aside from the knowledge that the child died from pneumonia, something that one would hope could be avoided if the will was there in those who have the means to charge the direction of one life. There is no sign, as you see, of the child's sex. There is no face to be identified. It is an image taken with care and empathy. The fact that the photographer is allowed to be present at such time of grief speaks volumes of the compassion of those present, something that is in direct contrast to how the media would have us view the patriarchal society in Afghanistan. And I assume Alexandra must have had the permission of the Taliban, as I had received myself in the same location 2 months later. Because back then, as you know, then no image was allowed of a person or a living thing, including a bird, which might fly into your frame. This image destroys so many preconceived notions. It illustrates an extreme tenderness and love, which, thanks to the West's focus on the barbarian attributes of the Taliban, deserved most likely most readers are unwilling to entertain, which of course prevents the possibility inducing an empathy towards these people in need. As you remember from her quote, Alexandra studied art history and did not hide this formation once she had become a war photographer in the Balkan disaster. For reasons of composition, aesthetics, and interpretation of death, the reference to Caravaggio's Entombment of Christ from 1603 in the chapel of the Santa Maria in Vallicella, made at the beginning, is important. First, because as photographers, we also happen to be involved in the business of education. Second, in my view, Alexandra gave the very best of her art education to depict the child's burial, creating an image of greatest intercultural competence and grace. Referring here to Occidental religious iconography, we are aware, of course, that one of the crassest, voyeuristic, and perhaps even pornographic depiction of suffering might be the crucifixion. The entombment, in contrast, mostly displays dignity, whereas the crucifixion screams and accuses. The suffering here is silent. And in this, yes, beautiful, sublime photographs, there is silence. Third, and to conclude, Alexandra's image is taken in a Muslim country. As such, by applying Western iconography, it makes the point that in existential moments, all humans are the same. Alexandra's image stands for deep understanding of what separates people and also brings them together.
Thank you, Daniel. We're going to move on to a selection of your own work. And just as we do that, can you tell us when you first went to Afghanistan and why did you decide to go to Afghanistan? And when you were there, how were you traveling around? Who were you able to work with? Were you embedded with anyone? What was the process of that?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that very briefly. I started going to the country in the late 90s because the country was part of the historical and political geography of a book I was working on between 95 and 2007. It was published under the title Traveling Through the Eye of History in 2009. So I did not go to Afghanistan to meet the Taliban or go to a country which was difficult to access, but because the Taliban simply had liberated the country from the warlords' self-dismemberment, and the country happened to be in the historical geography, which was sort of the main thing of my book, the arc of crisis, as I called it, between the Caspian and Kashmir, between the Iranian desert and Xinjiang. I traveled mostly independently. with trusted local companions, with the Taliban's permission and in some cases with escort to prevent me from Dostum's militias. I traveled always on roads, by horse and on foot. The roads are very, very important to me, especially in that book. The roads, it was all about the roads. I did one ISAF embed, including the arrest in Bagram Air Base. Embedded, I experienced no press freedom. I needed to resist to being instrumentalized within the ISAF's propaganda machinery. Breaking free was very difficult, in contrast to the 90s, when the Taliban allowed crossing the front line into Panjshir. I was commissioned by Swiss magazines and newspapers. They knew that my imagery would, or some of the imagery would end in a book and eventually in an exhibition. I went there self-assigned, and apart from the book, some of the photographs were entered a large exhibition in Zurich, Berlin, and some of them in San Francisco and in MoMA. Then you had another question. Yes, what did I want to achieve? I tried to achieve, and not only in Afghanistan, but wherever I go, I tried to produce photographs that are relevant beyond the news, which actually never interests me. And in line with my approach of history telling instead of storytelling. So that's my approach. Some of the image taken 20 or 10 years ago might seem now prophetic, but maybe they were the result of research, thinking, and some logic, which could be derived from the situations on the ground.
Great, thanks. Let's move through your selection then.
Yeah, so I start with the, was one of the earliest one, the top right, of course. It was 98, and it was terribly difficult because Taliban all around and people, you really had to be quick taking pictures of people. But when I could not resist here because it reminded me to something I had seen before, and obviously to the historic photographs of the first stage when the Bertolt Brecht's Mother Courage and Her Children in 1949 was first performed on a stage in Zurich. And as you know, Mother Courage plays out during the 30 Years' War, which devastated Europe. And it, of course, written in 1939, it was the anti-war play until to this day against the background of Nazism and fascism. And I was so struck when I looked at that picture today again, you know, the cart, which on that original, the wheels, it's exactly the same wheels, only here we have a girl pushing the cart and in the stage it was other. So it also shows you that I try to put a lot in my picture. Some people say I only make the photograph once after caption, which is somehow true. We can go on. And roads brought me to the gas line again. We are in Dostum's fiefdom in the northeast. Dostum was the engineer, Soviet-appointed engineer of this gas plant. It was always been his place. He has committed war crimes in his fortress. I traveled on road to Lashkar to Kandahar, from Kandahar down to Lashkar. You see the Ghaznavid ruins there. You know, reading the history of how several Arab conquerors tried to annihilate the Ghaznavid kingdom somehow played out again once British and American forces lost so many lives in that very, very difficult terrain of the Registan and to the west of it. Here this man waits on the betonka. The betonka is the concrete slab road which Khrushchev sold to the Afghan king in the 50s in a long perspective to invade Afghanistan or include it as a satellite in the Soviet Empire. And of course, these concrete slabs, they survived all the earthquakes and all the wars, whereas the American-built tarmac in the 60s linking Kandahar to Kabul was, for those of you who have traveled on it, it's basically sand buried. So this man waits there for donations. He's fixing potholes. It's also, yeah. Here, this is a diptych. It's between. It has sort of a news thing today because it shows the road leading from the Iranian border to Herat. And if you have followed how the Taliban came back to power, first they took the cross-border checkpoints for revenues and so forth. And so my question here is, and I probably should read this word piece. We see what we know, a road across a desert littered with countless landmines, a Soviet BM-2 armored troop carrier destroyed at some time during 20 years of war, shelter to 400 children, 8 hours spent filling potholes, earning 15,000 Afghani, the equivalent of 10 cents or 2 loaves of naan from drivers and passengers of an unknown number of container trucks transporting unknown quantities of consumer goods made in Japan from the Persian Gulf through Iran after Pakistan's clampdown on smuggling results in unknown millions of dollars in transit fees and duties, fueling war operations. So you see, I try sometimes to build a word piece with information which normally would go into a caption. Yeah, that's sort of, this picture was taken on a patrol with Macedonian forces. It's on the Bibi Maru Hill. And so there's a lot of the images which not only today, but already 10 years ago, sort of, that was the story as the essence of the whole thing, which was playing out. If you are looking for something is a business destination while there's still a war going on, something is definitely wrong, in my view. I was always more interested in how the rubber came to Afghanistan than sort of which general would now sort of follow the previous general of a Western Alliance force. Understanding how the rubber made it to Afghanistan is learning to understand the terrain, the roads and so forth. On top, having tea with the Taliban on the way to the drought-stricken Badghis province. And below you have a German Bundeswehr soldier who is having a hard time to eat the Uzbek national dish en route to Mazar because the Bundeswehr jet had to be diverted because of fog in Termes, which made Termes a very, very unsuitable escape route for all the forces who had been there. It's a Taliban checkpoint in Tagab Valley. As I said, they let you cross the string of tapes, of music tapes, and walk into the Panjshir. Of course, they were harassing people and stealing apples and cigarettes and all that. The scene of utter confusion in an ANA training camp and en route. As a male photographer, when you photograph women, you never know actually what's going on because you cannot ask, etc. So you're always stranded in a half or fractured wisdom of what you have photographed. Is your childbirth being guided through her marriage, or it's as a man, it's very difficult. You always miss more than half of a country, of a society. You see, if you look carefully, you see some armed people sitting on that erratic boulder. It was striking for me for 20 years, no one addressed the issue of irrigation, especially in a drought-stricken, irrigation-dependent country around the Hindu Kush. Glaciers there are melting, and of course, there's a looming water war coming. And if one have observed in the last days or weeks or months, the war increasingly took place outside the traditional fighting season, which makes one think, does climate change actually influence warfare? And so climate change or glacial melt becomes a variable of war. And with that, I think I can conclude my sequence.
Thanks very much, Daniel. We're going to go to Christopher next. Hopefully he comes back to, to his chair in a second. But I will just get the share organized for him while we're doing that.
Yeah, Afghanistan. It's been an appealing draw for photojournalism since, at least for me, since the 80s. Myself, I had started an agency called Black Star, and through the 80s, they had many photographers that were venturing to Afghanistan. And I used to watch them prepare to leave for their trips, everybody from Steve McCurry to Reza. There was a whole group associated with Black Star that were going into Afghanistan, mostly from around the mid 80s to the late 80s. And the stories I had always heard from people was, to be honest with you, I was afraid of Afghanistan. I was afraid of being in way over my head. And then in 1988, when the Soviets started their pullout and all that, I started understanding that maybe I would like to go there. And I eventually went to Peshawar in Pakistan in '89 because the different Mujahideen groups were trying to form a coalition government to try to get rid of the Najibullah, the leader, the Soviet puppet leader of Afghanistan. So I had went to Pakistan, and in Peshawar, I spent several months. They had a shura, and eventually I hooked up with a group, Jamiat Islami, which was one of the more moderate groups that you could work with. They had launched a unified assault on Jalalabad, and this is the picture you see here. You can probably go to the next, David. I had made it into Jalalabad, but they were getting, they weren't doing well. And I realized I was kind of in over my head, and I ended up going back into Pakistan and realizing I had, I had covered a lot of conflicts in Asia, South America, and this was the first time I would classify that I ever covered real war. So they had regrouped, and I had found out, speaking to the Jamiat Islami people, that they were going to launch a big offensive in Kandahar in a month, a unified group to take the airport in Kandahar. So they brought me down to Quetta and then across the border at Spimbaldak, and I basically waited around 3 weeks, close to a month, for this attack on the airport. And what was frightening for me is culturally, it was so foreign to me, and I was not with any other Western journalists. I wasn't with a writer. I had a translator that was given to me called the Tajiman, but on our first day in the Kandahar area, we were under heavy shelling and got bombed by a plane, and he left. That night I woke up, he was gone. He had packed up his bags and he had fled in the desert. You can go ahead, David, pass through. This whole groups in this area around Kandahar. This was, I at this depot, they brought in a truckload of these boxes with Stinger missiles. And as a photographer, I knew the value of trying to photograph. To me, it was like, oh my God, this is the holy grail, because this one weapon is what defeated the Soviets. So this is them going off in the battle to move out towards this airport area. I did not go with them. Sorry about that. Broke up. This is a fighter that was killed. This is in the village that we were near from the airport. We weren't far from the airport in the desert plain. It was probably a good 10 kilometers away, but you could see the airport. What was hard about being in this spot, it was like a shepherd village. There were around 10 mud houses that we were living in, but the Najibullah's government, they knew where we were, and it was easy for them to target with shelling and planes and all that. And I was over my head. I wanted out. And I ended up riding on the windshield of this truck on the hood because they wouldn't let me ride in the back with the bodies, and I wanted out. I hadn't been able to basically speak to anybody that understood me for several days at this point. I wanted out. I felt I was way in over my head, culturally, and yeah. And at that point, I had really go back there. This is several days before the battle. These are all the different Afghan groups, their leaders meeting for like a shur in the desert for this planned attack. What I was extremely afraid of were the Wahhabis. There were Hekmaktiar's people in the area, and I had been warned by Peter Juvenile and some others before I had went in to stay away from the Saudis and the Wahhabis and Hekmaktiar. They had recently killed a journalist by smashing a rock on his head while he was sleeping in the night. And I always had that fear. Because basically out there, I was living with these people. There were no women. It was young boys and male fighters. The only time I encountered a female population was in Quetta and in the Spinbaldak area. But out here in the plains near the Kandahar, I did not encounter women. You'll notice that all this is transparencies. I had to shoot film. I only had so much film on me. It's different today when you work. You can continuously photograph. Digital is kind of unlimited. Back then, you only had the film that you carried. So there were a lot of things that I saw that I would not photograph because I was, I couldn't get resupplied with film. And go ahead next. Which leads to later, September 11th happened. And I remember all my colleagues were getting ready to go off to Afghanistan and to Pakistan, and I had no desire. I had no desire to go back to that place because of my experiences there. This is one of the few images that I like from September 11th. I was, you may pause this for a second, David, the show, because it's kind of an interesting story. Seven had formed in Perpignan. We had announced the formation of Seven. I'm not sure if it was September 6th or September 7th, something like that. But I was I had stopped conflict photography, and I was assigned to the White House by Time Magazine. And my month's rotation to cover the White House was supposed to start September 1st, but because we were launching the agency, I was delayed. You can go ahead and fast forward. Go ahead, David, play. Pause this here. So back to this story. I basically ended up having to leave. I had an assignment from Time before. They wanted me to go to the Caribbean to shoot internet gambling. And I ended up missing my flight from France in Perpignan out of Barcelona. And with Jim, we were there and stuff. And I asked Jim Noctway if he would be willing to do the Time assignment. And, he was planning on flying to Paris and spending some time in Paris before going back to States. To make a long story short, Jim took the assignment to go to the Caribbean, and Jim flew back to New York on like September 9th, September 10th. I flew back to Florida where I live. Arrived here on basically September 10th because I was supposed to then fly up to Washington. My access covering at the White House, I encountered different people. This led to me gaining access to Tommy Franks and CENTCOM. This is the war room with the other allied. They're getting ready to do their satellite feeds into Afghanistan. This is in January of 2002, so it's pretty much after they've already succeeded in Afghanistan. Go ahead and fast forward the image. Through that meeting, I had Tommy Franks was not interested of me photographing him, and he's the one who suggested, why aren't you photographing the troops? And I said, well, the only troops you have there are special forces. And basically, we set up a trip from CENTCOM for me to fly all the way to Bagram, unescorted on military assets, to be embedded with. It was a camp outside of Kabul where they were starting to train the new Afghan army, but their main soul was to go off on missions. They had 10, I believe it was 10 or 12 teams of 12 members in each team, so it was a large special forces base. Originally, they would not let me. I had only 2 of the 10 teams at this camp would let me photograph them. As you hold this picture here for a second, David, if you'll notice on their backs, these packs probably weigh 70 kilos or 140, 150 pound packs. They're getting ready to get deployed by helicopter. They would get dropped off anywhere from 2, 3, 5 days, week at a time. They would not let me go with them because they saw me in the shower with them. They saw my body. They saw my physique. They knew that I would not be up for the trip. So any kind of missions I would do with them were overland by vehicle, by these Toyota, Hilux vehicles. This is them. This is actually a special forces guy with some Afghan army guys. They're on a walking patrol, training them how to patrol. Remember, this is 2002, so this is early on. Go ahead. These are some the new trainees, Afghan National Army, being formed. This is a group of special forces guys. They would do these night rides late in the afternoon, out into the evening, and just open desert. Like this moment, these foreigners in this foreign land, Go ahead and move. Again, I'm in the back of a vehicle. They would ride around. There were no armored vehicles at this time. They didn't even have armored Humvees, anything like that. They rode around in soft skin vehicles. I had no idea what they were doing. I was just kind of along for the ride. I was shooting film at this time. I still hadn't switched to digital. This is some like cave complex things where the mountain starts. So they would go and they would just go through these, yeah, not much to say about this. Is just out. These are the vehicles that they would move around in. Things were changing. What was interesting about my time with the special forces there, they were already all talking about Iraq. A lot of them knew that Iraq was coming. So again, this is 2002, so we're a year away from the invasion of Iraq. Just thought it was ironic, this skull ring. This is interesting. This is a Delta forces. So you have different ranges, even special forces. This is like an elite of the elite. This is this is in Kabul. This is outside the American embassy. He was in the helicopter. President Bush went to Afghanistan on a surprise visit, and he was one of the security that was in the helicopter I was riding in. They had all these kind of like Delta operators, but I just thought it was so fascinating because these people normally do not let you photograph them. These are Afghan employees at the American embassy. I believe it's 2005. This is, I'm not sure, 2005, 2006. I don't have the caption in front of me.
2006.
But I love the, yeah, 2006. So these are Afghan employees at the American embassy. They help, with visas and all that. This is inside the American embassy compound. I just put it in there. I found it because I rarely saw, there's Karzai with Bush arriving. I just put in this political stuff.
And that's the end of your selection, Chris.
Yeah. I feel it's awkward for me to have to talk about this, but I knew that a lot of my colleagues they really fall in love with Afghanistan and get seduced by the country. My initial trip there was so physically hard and frightening that the country, it kind of scared me, and I basically stayed away from it. But
Chris, one of the questions I
ahead.
wanted to ask you is that when you were, so the early pictures in 1989, you were actually embedded with an Islamic group, and then
Yes.
you were embedded with the US military.
Yes.
Um,
At different times.
Same sort of experience embedded in both groups.
Well,
one different to the other.
Yeah,
what sort of
differently
perspective?
culturally. Being embedded with the Mujahideen group, your life is in their line. They feed you and everything. But there were things culturally that I was not prepared for. This whole bit of their demeaning of women, this hatred of women, and their kind of, I was told things by them and by their complete unrespect for the woman. I realized this was the group I was with, but they did not, they feel that women were worthy of men. I saw homosexuality, I saw drug use, sexual assault, not against female, but male on male, male on boy. All this stuff was very frightening to me. I was 32. I had a very hard time growing a beard. Every night when I went to bed, I was nervous. I was afraid. So then the whole factoring in the stuff with the combat. My mistake was not being with another journalist, a Western journalist, that I could bounce ideas off and things, because I was basically kind of at their mercy, especially once my Taji man left. My Taji man was the link to the commanders of the Jamiat al-Islami that inserted me with a group. And once he left, I was on my own. And there was no even really communication skill of me having to get out. And my ultimate goal though was for me photographically. I was not on assignment. I went on speculation. Back in the 80s, we used to do trips. They called it speculation. With Black Star, you would go on a trip and then you would try to sell it or get a thing. My key and my holy grail, I was trying to get an image of them firing the Stinger. So I just knew the importance of that image, that symbolic image. So, and then I wanted out. Go ahead. Sorry, Dave.
Did you feel that you had freedom to photograph while you were there?
Yes.
With
Yeah.
them?
They have no. Yeah. There was none of this. They weren't. I just, like I said, I had to be careful of the Wahhabis. You could tell by their headdress and their dress, and they made me always kind of stay inside the hut. They didn't want me, because the Wahhabis were very anti-Western. They don't even want you in their presence. You're so kind of like unclean to them that, yeah. So it's a different dynamics being embedded with the Americans or being embedded with the Mujahideen, but they're hospitable. Yeah, but they just settle things. Things are settled differently. Culturally, things are done differently. Even with disputes. So I'll leave it
and
at
what
that.
Sort of restrictions did you felt that you faced when you were embedded with the Americans? Did you feel free to photograph there?
No, even then I had letters from the top commanders from CENTCOM, but they told me when I went there that they cannot order. It's different than traditional troops. These are special forces. They cannot be ordered to do anything for you, meaning you're going to have to get them to accept you. So there were many people in the camp. Like I said, there were over 100 special forces. There were only around 20 of these special forces that would allow me to photograph them. So I had a lot of restrictions. I couldn't go around the camp photographing all these special forces because they didn't want to be photographed. So I had those rules to abide by. I didn't have to share my film with anybody or show it. It just has to become trust. But only 2 of the teams that I was with would let me photograph them.
There's a question from Hillary in the audience. She wanted to ask whether the 2002 Special Forces mission that you were photographing, were they involved at that time in the search for bin Laden? Was that part of their mission?
The group I was with, I think probably in support roles, but I think that was more Delta operators. There was this, I think it's come out in the news, there was this base on the other side of the airport, the CIA base. That was another base. So yeah, I'm sure they were involved, but they weren't the direct ones that are hunting. That was Delta Force. These are regular special forces. There's like different tiers. But no. And what was interesting for me as a journalist, they refused to let me be with them until they put me through weapons training. I basically did almost 3 weeks of weapons training with these people. And when I say weapons training, they would bring me out because as a journalist, I never carry a weapon. I never want to have a weapon, but they refused to allow me in the vehicle unless I knew how to use weapons, because to them, if they're under attack, they don't want me taking pictures. They want me to pick up a weapon. So everything from hand grenades to C4 explosives, shotguns, big guns, small guns. So it was an enlightening trip for me to learn about weapons and stuff, even though I am very kind of anti-weapon. I live in America. I don't own a weapon. I don't own a gun.
Yeah. That's great, Chris. Thanks very much. I think it's time to move on to Seamus. Seamus, are you there with your camera ready?
I am.
And you'll be doing your own share screen.
Yeah. So this is the old city of Kabul in 1994. That was the first time I went to Afghanistan. One-legged man, wounded from the war, braves a break in the fighting and shelling. It was a really bad time. It was a brutal civil war. It was my first time ever going to a war, a bit like what Chris was talking about, although I had a lot more luck in terms of I was with a journalist and I met extraordinary people, and you know, it was very different to Kandahar and being with those guys that Chris was with. But at the time, there was a deadly power struggle between the various Mujahideen commanders and leaders. Everything was stripped bare. You know, there was no excess. Schoolrooms, anything public, all the wood was stripped off seats and tables. It was like a city of bones. It was extraordinary. And here's the same place, my most recent trip in May this year. Well, you can see the difference. And these are some other photographs from that trip in May 2021. This is after 20 years of foreign engagement, American in particular, in response to 9/11. It's kind of interesting to think how it would look if 9/11 had never happened, or if the Soviets hadn't invaded and the Americans hadn't responded by pumping billions of dollars in weapons into the country to fight the Cold War. We wouldn't have had the Taliban or bin Laden or the millions of people that have since been displaced and killed. And it's a real time to reflect on that now that, you know, the 20 years is up and the Americans have left, and, you know, we see what's happening in the meantime. This is a small little cricket club that was just started when I was there in May. I mean, people still had hope that things would work out. You know, in the news now, we're being told that the Taliban said women are allowed to have any sport. So it's pretty sad stuff. This is 1994 again. It's I didn't go to Afghanistan for the war at all. I never had dreams of being a war photographer or having anything to do with conflict. But it was my experience of going there in 94, and it was quite a transformative experience that opened up a whole world to me of you know, what going to places of conflict is like, how they define history, the people you meet in these places, you know, their stories. It was just a whole thing that I'd never really thought about before going. You know, I originally went to Afghanistan. My oldest sister was a big influence in my life, and she had been to Afghanistan just before the Soviet invasion as part of the hippie trail. And she raved about Afghanistan above all the other places that she'd been to, the gentleness and the humor, the beauty and the humanity of the people. So when the Russians invaded, it was already on my radar. You know, I was watching the news as a teenager. Recently I made a film about Russian veterans of the Soviet war in Afghanistan. For many of them, Afghanistan at that time represented something quite different to the Western perspective. They could buy cassette recorders and jeans. You know, it was a place of opportunity back then, which they couldn't dream of getting in the Soviet Union. But in 1994, I was working as a photographer, and there was an opportunity to go to Afghanistan for the Observer newspaper. It was in the middle of the Civil War, yet most people assumed once the Russians had left the war, it was all over and it was peaceful. We rarely heard much about Afghanistan. It didn't make the news. But when I went there in 94, the Red Cross estimated that more people were being killed at that time in Kabul than anywhere else in the world. There were no foreign forces or even a tangible UN presence, just some NGOs. And it was called by then a forgotten war. But I realized that wars are not just about armies and weapons and casualties. They're also about people who find themselves in extreme situations, usually through no fault of their own. And that interested me a lot. Naturally, I am an outsider. I'm not an Afghan, but I never felt, like Chris was saying, it was such an alien environment here, and I can imagine how he described it would be, but I never felt that. I obviously didn't share the poverty of the people that I was meeting, but their openness and the dignity that they were suffused with more than equalized our relationship. I was humbled. I mean, it was really humbling to be around these people and only reinforced my respect for them and their resilience, their attitude to life. So I wanted to capture something of the extraordinary lives that survived in this place with its stark history and sense of independence. And I'm still trying. That's what keeps, dragging me back to Afghanistan. I've been there almost 20 times now. But as I said earlier, the war was only a part of the story for me. And the Afghans remind me of my own tribe, the Irish. We love company and poetry, and most things can be made fun of. We also share similar complicated colonial histories and a struggle for independence. So I've never really felt out of place there, which is a bizarre thing to say, obviously, because culturally we're so different. But there is a human connection, and a lot of people have talked about this and experienced this. This is Bamiyan. This is where the Buddhas were in that space to the right of the frame. And this is a Hazara man. Bamiyan is basically a Hazara province, and the Hazara are Shia Muslim and will have a very difficult time with the Taliban. This was in 2000. I made a trip to meet Masood in the north. He was holding on against the Taliban, fighting the Taliban. He had this little strip of land up in the north. I spent a few weeks up there. These are some of his men. These are Uzbeks fighting with Masood, crossing the Amudarya River, which is on the border with Tajikistan. Very basic stuff. These are animal bladders, goat's bladders. They're using as craft. And again, what Chris was saying when I was with the journalists, but you are really at their mercy. And in our case, it was incredibly hospitable, and they were very keen to safeguard us and keep us secure. But you are in a wilderness, and you really have to trust the people you're with. This was we visited a post on the top of a mountain, and the night before, some Taliban had tried to overrun it, and this Taliban guy was killed in the process. So after that initial trip, 1994 trip, which completely hooked me to the country, I continued going there. I made 4 trips before 9/11, including 2 in 96, when the Taliban were gaining power, having taken Herat, which I visited early in 96, and then in November after they'd taken Kabul in October. So my experience of the country was very much for the Afghan people, and nothing really much to do with foreign involvement. So some of my best experiences were staying in villages, in the countryside, and photographing the way of life. After 9/11, I continued, going to the country, and it was while driving into Afghanistan in October 2001, I realized that I wanted to make a book on Afghanistan, which was ultimately published in 2008. Here we see locals gathering to see the first American planes coming to bomb Kabul, bomb the Taliban Authority, and also their front lines. There's a daisy cutter bomb annihilating a whole front line of Taliban soldiers. I did one embed in 2002 with the Americans just to get some access to the American war machine. But other than that, all my work has been about the Afghans and around the Afghans. On the embed that lasted 3 days, I slept out in the mountains with the soldiers as they searched and destroyed old arms and weapons dumps. The restrictions I found were that they and I were surrounded by a ring of steel, and any Afghan people you encountered were naturally affected and intimidated by that. The Afghans were friendly to the Americans, but neither side really trusted the other. There certainly could not have been any of the intimacy between me and the people, which I found when I was traveling in the countryside alone, but for an Afghan interpreter. And it's what I always try and aim for in my work, a sense of intimacy. This is the first democratic elections in Afghanistan. This is a woman voting, but the woman on the left is, verifying who she is, because obviously the burqa is concealing her identity. This is President Karzai in his palace with an American bodyguard. Through fear of assassination, he fired his Afghan security and employed Americans instead. This would be in 2004. Sorry, 2002. This is actually Karzai had been opening the construction of the Kandahar to Kabul to Kandahar highway, and this is him and his crew heading back to Kabul. I think the locals were a bit bemused. This is a group of women called Mirman Behir. They're extraordinary. They're poets, and they're able to meet and share their poetry during the presence of Western powers. I mean, of course, once the Americans and the Western powers leave, people like this and the opportunities that they had will dry up. And this shot was taken early after the Taliban had fled Kabul and their administration had collapsed. People weren't entirely and completely sure about the Taliban era being over, but they knew big changes were happening that day. And they gathered on the streets. When they saw a foreign photographer stand on the roof of his Jeep and take this photograph, there was an explosion of joy and celebration. I showed this photograph to a number of people in the government on my last trip to Afghanistan, and they all experienced great sadness at the loss of hope after 20 years, the waste of life they saw, and I suppose how they had failed their people. These are people, this is 94, people fleeing Kabul, fleeing the fighting, heading to Pakistan on a bus. This is Masood, who I went to see in 2000 and who was assassinated 2 days before 9/11. He was an extraordinary leader. He was the Lion of Panjshir, defied the Russians, kind of held out against the Taliban. Great speculation always is what would have happened if he'd survived, if he hadn't been killed, would he have tolerated an American presence? He actually predicted or was sharing with foreign powers some big attack in America in 2001, but he was ignored. This is the Taliban in Herat in 1996. They had this thing about no photographs, but if they were away from their commanders, they were very vain and loved to be photographed. This is a war widow begging in Kabul in 96. They lose their men through war, and then they're not allowed to work, so there's nothing else for them to do but to beg. This is up in Badakhshan, an area with the Ismaili people. They're a Shia sect, and because they're Shia, the women can reveal their faces. Usually they cover their hair. This woman is obviously young enough that she doesn't have to do that. These are 3 Mujahideen protecting that mountaintop. This is where that picture of the dead Taliban soldier, this was in that area. Medieval type of warfare, protecting the top of a mountain in the middle of nowhere. This is a Soviet tank washed over by the Panjshir River. And that's the show.
Thank you very much, Seamus. If you can just end your screen share there.
Sure. Yeah.
And Ron, we will conclude with you before discussion. So I will bring up your images.
Yeah, thanks, David. So as you've already heard, all of us from 7, except for Jim, were still in Europe, mostly in France, when 9/11 happened. And it became pretty obvious that Afghanistan was going to be the place to go. And at that time, I was on contract with Newsweek, and they asked me to immediately go to Afghanistan, but I felt I had to go back to New York, my home, and sort of document what had happened in New York, with a plan to go to Afghanistan later, which is what I did. And a few weeks after working in New York, I flew to Moscow, and then transferred over with my colleague Alana Ozernoy to Tajikistan. And in Tajikistan, which borders Afghanistan, they had sort of the Northern Alliance, the resistance to the Taliban. They had their kind of ministry office and so on, and journalists from around the world descended there to be able to figure out a way to get into Afghanistan with the help of the Northern Alliance. So we had one group of journalists thinking that they're going to cover this war from going through Tajikistan, and another group of journalists all went to Quetta in Pakistan, thinking that they'd be closer to Kabul from there. I thought it would be better to be inside the country. So as you saw in the picture with Seamus, I crossed that river with the Northern Alliance and wound up in a small town called Jabal Siraj, which was as close as you could get to Kabul. It was basically a frontline town between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance. And there was roughly about probably 30 or so journalists living in this little village with no electricity, no running water, waiting for the war to start, which it did in October, when the Americans started to bomb the Taliban positions. And you can see in the next photograph, you immediately start to see that this is the first sort of real show of power from the American military, I think, since the first Gulf War, the shock and awe. And now we had B-52s flying and dropping bombs and so on, which was pretty impressive. But immediately you started to see mistakes made by the American military. And here there's a funeral of a family killed by a mistaken B-52 bomb. So the impact immediately started to go beyond the soldiers and started to affect everybody. And the life that they were leading in this Panjshir Valley, this place that was secure from the Taliban, was remnant of what you've seen already from Seamus and others, remnants of the Soviet Union. This is a young girl with a destroyed Soviet tank. And what was really kind of remarkable about living with these people, and basically we were doing that, was that everybody had only known war. They had grown up with war. The average age person you met was probably 20 to 30, and all they knew was the concept of war, and they didn't expect anything to be anything different. The other thing that I found really interesting was that when I first arrived, the conversation would be about the Taliban or about the enemy and so on. But as they listened more and more to the rhetoric coming from the United States administration about terrorists, about like the terrorism was the key word, that every time that they referred to the Taliban, they would call them terrorists, and that they were engaging in kind of the propaganda aspect of what the West was stating, and that they were going to be the partners on the ground of the West against the terrorists to save America from another future attack. Let's go to the next one. Here you see the Northern Alliance on the ground watching, the streaks of the B-52s as they kind of came in. We go to the next photograph. And the way that they fought was very haphazardly, very disorganized. They had really kind of baptism by fire or no real training. And I often found myself kind of sort of getting caught up with the energy and chaos and craziness of the fighting against the Taliban, and kind of just running with these soldiers who really actually had no idea what they were doing. And their sense of danger was incredibly different than mine. As I mentioned, having only experienced war, I remember standing with a group of Northern Alliance soldiers, and somebody opened fire on us, and I thought that the bullets were pretty close, and I hit the ground as one would do. And when the firing stopped, I looked up and not one of them had moved, and they were all laughing at me, saying, "Why did you get your pants so dirty?" It was like I realized then, like, it was a very different way of looking at the world, and it was in fact actually a very sad way, that their kind of understanding of danger and so on was so degraded to the degree that it had to be crazy dangerous for them to even feel afraid. We'll go to the next image, please. And you would have these sort of surreal scenes, so these guys leading them into battle against the Taliban with a sword and with obviously AK-47s and so on, but it was like very difficult and a dangerous place, I think, to work, mostly, of course, for themselves and for the civilians. I mean, I, of course, along with my colleagues, was there voluntarily, but it was still this kind of constant kind of understanding of the danger that was going on. As you see in this next photograph, myself and Tyler Hicks were traveling with these Northern Alliance, and they basically, we followed them into an incredibly terrible position where the Taliban had the upper hand, and we had to take refuge in a ditch, which was created, it's a crater created by a B-52 bomb, along with some Afghan soldiers, including this commander. And it was basically, as we were kind of waiting for safety, a sniper took a position and just started firing into where we were, eventually shooting this soldier, this commander, who I think basically he's passing away right here. They tried to save him, but they weren't able to. And they were fighting for things that they believed in, but they were also kind of these real kind of definitive differences between their Taliban and we're not. And here are two young Taliban fighters that were taken prisoner by the Northern Alliance just on the outskirts of Kabul. And they had the Northern Alliance, for the most part, had not really experienced journalists or knew what we were, and basically thought that any sort of white person was a US government person or a CIA person or something like that. So when I encountered this scene in my broken Dari, I was able to kind of convince them that I was a government, that I was from the government, and that they could not execute these young Taliban soldiers, and they had to hand them over to their authorities to make sure that they were still alive. And that's what they did as far as I know in this situation. And here I was with, this is kind of basically a reverse of what happened a couple of weeks ago. This is the Northern Alliance entering Kabul as the Taliban fled. And it was primarily, while there was some fighting, but it was very similar, and basically commanders just decided to switch sides at the last minute. Al-Qaeda fled and the city fell pretty quickly. It was really just a small group of journalists, similar to the amount that was there recently, that were able to document this sort of changeover in power. And this began the kind of American occupation of Kabul. And of course, one of the first things that that you would see was that women began to feel comfortable. One, obviously here being with a strange Western male, which is already a big deal. Second, taking off their burqas, letting me see their faces and photograph them. This is kind of an immediate sort of change that happened within 24 hours or so of the Taliban fleeing. And I like this photograph just simply, these are burqas drying. The burqa obviously is a symbol for many people of oppression of women, and to me, in some ways, kind of at that time seemed to be possibly kind of a representation of the end of that situation, but obviously only becoming a temporary one, as we can see today. And movies, balloons, music. People were able to cut their beards. All these kind of restricted things that the Taliban regime had projected onto the people, certainly in Kabul, started to be removed, and society changed incredibly quickly. And the question sort of become like, what was good, what was bad for the society? Because a lot of the restrictions that the Taliban had also existed under Northern Alliance in the countryside, where they were more conservative than in the city. So one of the things that became very apparent, that Kabul was not Afghanistan, and Afghanistan was not Kabul. And this was one of the more shocking things. Myself and colleagues in the New York Times, we found what was an Al-Qaeda house, sort of a command center. And these are things that we found on the ground. This is photographed inside. And if you remember, of course, one of the issues with the attack of 9/11 was that they had trained in US flight schools. And here we see a Microsoft flight simulator. We see advertisement for flying schools. There was some papers and so on that said, learn how to use these things. Now, of course, I have no idea whether 9/11 was hatched in this place or not, but it was really seeing kind of all these things was, in terms of kind of the American part, the retribution for 9/11 kind of brought things to an interesting kind of full circle. And then this photograph is of Northern Alliance soldiers. Kind of, they had found a globe in the world, and they were basically playing soccer with it. And I found this sort of, symbolic yet obvious, but still the symbolism of it is basically, in the end, the Afghans are kind of always kind of, kicking the world around. The world is kind of reacting to them, and all of this work was put into a book called Afghanistan, the Road to Kabul, which turned out to be the first digital monograph book ever done, because Afghanistan was probably the first war that almost everybody had to photograph digital in order to get their work out. And I did this book with Alana Osmoroy. I just want to read this one concluding paragraph to the book, which came out basically at the end of 2001. And it basically says, she writes, "We followed our instincts and scrambled to make our way to one of the most remote and undeveloped countries in the world. In Afghanistan, we discovered a world of mystery and contradictory beauty, a culture so close to the outside world that instead of delving into its malleable heart, our efforts merely chipped away at its hard outer shell. We also discovered what appeared too good to be true, how quickly it all come together, the war, the bombings, the flight school advertisements on a dirty floor in Kabul. America had cornered the bad guys, the terrorists, but it was impossible to imagine peace in a country where allies turned to enemies overnight, where warlords made government bedfellows, where corruption seeped into every crack of society. War in Afghanistan had long taken on a life of its own, and it jeered into the sunburned faces of American soldiers. I was here before you, and I will stay long after you're gone." I think it's very incredibly prophetic of what she wrote and what we have in that book, and that's where we are, unfortunately, today. I think that the hope was, with the work that I did there for magazines and eventually the book, that it was a bit of an awareness, reckoning of what was happening, of what people needed to look out for. I think that as we read more and more about the failures of the American policy and the Afghan government, you'll see why what's happened today is really not such a great surprise.
Thanks, Ron. One question for you, just thinking about working with the Northern Alliance forces. Were they hospitable to you and welcoming to you because they wanted a particular perspective, particular story to be going out to the world? In other words, did they have a media strategy that you were part of?
Absolutely. I think, as I said, that kind of using the word terrorist, they totally understood what was happening. They totally understood what role that they were to play, the support that they needed. Obviously, they had already been fighting the Taliban for quite a while before 9/11. And I think that they understood, especially at that time, given there was no social media, that we as a Western journalists were their messengers to the West.
So just a reminder to the audience, if you want to ask some questions, please drop them in the Q&A box. We're happy to pose those to the participants. But I have a question for actually everybody. And that is, I'd like you to reflect on what you think is the major determinant or some of the major determinants that create the look of war coming out of a situation like Afghanistan over the year. Is it the constraints of embedding? Is it the reason that you go? Or, importantly, we have to recognize that you're all from the international community, you're all male, you're all white. Does that have a particular perspective? Does that shape your work in a particular way? What do you think are the primary constraints or determinants of your work in Afghanistan over the years?
I can just address it quickly on one angle, where I think it's imperative for the audience to understand that when they're looking at any of our work, that is like one small sliver of what's going on. That it should not, the work should be interpreted as all-encompassing, like this is exactly what's happening in Afghanistan. And I think in today's world, where the ability to view so many different authors and media feeds and so on, the audience has to be a little bit more active in going around and constructing, looking at what it looks like from the left. What does it look like from the right? What does it look like from the international observer? And what does it look like from the local observer? And then when you sort of feel then as a consumer of all of this work, then hopefully you can make a good determination about what's going on. But I think just quickly, like one of the criticisms of embeds was not that the embed itself. The embed, I thought, as one who was embedded during the Iraq War, was this amazing opportunity to witness, as Seamus referenced, the American military machine. But that's not the entire war. That is like one small part of it. The problem was that when it was presented and accepted as, oh, this is the only thing that's going on, you're only seeing it through this perspective of the American military. That's a major mistake. But as one component of it, then I think it has value.
Right.
And also, when you think, most of what came out of Afghanistan in the 20 years, I think that they made it to the front pages or made it to, the mainstream media. They were embeds. Most of the work you saw from Afghanistan was really in the foreground was the soldier, was the American soldier. It was like, what's happening to them? I mean, what's the policy in Washington determining these guys, what they're doing next? Are they going to stay? It was all from the American perspective. I'm not knocking it as such, but I'm just saying that, our reference to Afghanistan was of actually American soldiers. Before 9/11, it was a forgotten war. It was very hard to get assignments to go there. I went there 4 times before 9/11. And then afterwards, it was like a feeding frenzy. But it was all about the American perspective. Very little of it was really about the Afghans.
It's exactly, if I can pick up from what Seamus says, the forgotten war during Taliban time. There was really the Afghan fatigue, these barbarians killing each other. There was an earthquake, there were avalanches. The donor community had a fatigue, and the Taliban had a problem somehow comparable to the image problem today. The picture which Alexandra took in that drought-stricken area where went about the same time. There was 2 million people were on the verge of a major famine. The World Food Programme had asked for help, but because the Taliban were Stone Age and Middle Age and all that, no food arrived. And so that was one thing, that forgotten war, because the West had won the Cold War. We were on the party. That was an old legacy. We wanted to that was very, very inconvenient that there's something going on, And the second thing was the time constraints. I found out that, many people who went in, they were in a rush. Everybody wanted to rush to Bamiyan to get, to photograph the destruction. If you hold out in Islamabad and in Peshawar a week, 10 days, all of a sudden people understood that you want to photograph the Afghans who were suffering under the drought. That made them interesting for you. I remember in Kandahar, I arrived in Kandahar in that house there in May 2001, and I stayed in that house for a week. I did not go out. The journalist wanted to go out. He had never been before. I said, go, take your walks. I will stay in that house. The temptation to make pictures is too big. I will risk our assignment because, no picture allowed. We had that stamp in our visa, that paper. But basically that turned out to be very, very helpful towards building trust. There were young Taliban commanders coming in every afternoon, sipping tea. Then they went back. They went to Mullah Omar's house. They were preparing things. They came to take orders. And at that time, in the evening, they would question me. I mean, I was their guest, and as a guest, you are asked to tell them where you come from, what you are doing. So I told them about Swiss medieval mountain warfare, compared Switzerland with Afghanistan, mountains, roads, fierce fighters, all that, until we had to kill each other because we were mercenaries to different European kings. So I found that was, if you go to Afghanistan and have a clock, you will have a very hard time. You need time. Things are being discussed and decided while having tea. I found the hospitality by the Taliban amazing, not because they were Taliban or because I'm very sympathetic to what some groups are doing, but because I was their guest. I felt more secure in Sorubi, in the tea house, staying at night, with a Taliban guard outside the door protecting, because they knew they would sacrifice their life in order to protect me, because I was the guest. And that was their main problem. At that time in Kandahar, there was the talk that the guest will destroy the house. And the guest, of course, was Osama bin Laden. And they had sent at that time a young, educated Afghan to Washington to try to open a channel, and he was taken out to have a hamburger with a subaltern of the Foreign Office, and basically they did not respond to that. So similar to what Ron says to Masood, everybody was trying, different parties were trying to raise awareness in the West, the different parts of the West, also in Paris. Masood went to Strasbourg. That they have a problem which they could not await because of the hospitality, which is a big part of the culture in the Hindu Kush.
Thanks, Daniel. Chris, do you want to add any reflections on what you think the major determinants on the look of war and the role that your identity plays in that?
Thing is, my identity comes from this whole role of, it was the Cold War. Mine was formed from the 80s, my version of Afghanistan. And again, you speak of this lack of interest in the West. Basically, once Najibullah was out and then the Civil War started, there was no interest in the West. I mean, it was even difficult to get assignments in the 80s to try to go into Afghanistan. So it was just one of these places that was just ignored. And that's why Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda was such an easy place to go in and set up, basically their own state, which is the fear again today. What's going to happen going forward? And for me, I feel optimistic though. I mean, it's like, I want this to let the Afghans be Afghans. I feel for them this kind of like 20 years of hope for some kind of change and democracy. But, to me, it's like many generations, centuries to change. And on what right do we as Westerners have to force this changes on a society? There's such cultural taboos and things that are so offensive to an Afghan that from our Western eyes, we don't understand. We we just don't get it. The easy ways to offend them, and us in our own pride and arrogance can't understand why they are offended. Even me, when I see this kind of like challenging the Taliban leaders when female journalists interview them and they aren't covered, or I even saw a Western one, she didn't have her head covered. Forget even if he's Taliban, it's just an insult. It's insult. There's just different cultural things, you know, and I feel that the Western societies on a whole don't really understand that, and we really try to force our cultures on their culture. Yeah, and I also feel bad just even speaking about the subject, because I feel like in the essence I have no right to even speak on the subject.
A couple of questions from the audience. Just a reflection on from your time working in Afghanistan. How do you think Afghan photojournalism has evolved over the years? We see a lot more Afghan reporters. Are there more Afghan photojournalists? Has the interaction with Western journalists or photojournalists helped or hindered that? And do you think there's an Afghan perspective from Afghan photojournalists that would be different to yours?
I'm sure there would be. I mean, there's certainly a lot of Afghan journalists and photographers that have emerged. You know, and I mean, what'll happen to them now, we don't know, especially the women. But you know, there's a whole generation out there. You know, Masood Hosseini. There's loads of them that are out there doing great work. I think they're very influenced by the West because, you know, commercially, you know, just economically, they have to sort of provide the work that gets sold, and so that there's a, you know, the commercial imperative. But as I say, we don't know what's going to happen now. But had it continued, I think we would have seen photographers emerging with their own voice more so. I think in time, I did see extraordinary set of pictures. I don't know, I can't remember the name of the photographer, but it was they were art pictures, and they were actually photographed in Algeria, because the Afghan was living in Algeria, and he recreated this myth of a horseman, and it was anyway, it was very unusual stuff. I'm not saying it, you know, only an Afghan could have done that, but I think we would have seen more of that coming, and maybe also with the generation that have fled, you know, the big brain drain that, you know, when we look at Kabul airport over those last few weeks, you know, the best and the brightest were leaving, you know, and it's a dreadful shame for the country, but maybe they'll continue in other countries. And we'll get a perspective with the diaspora, you know, again, the Irish, you know, we've had to go all over the world, and, you know, we've made our voices heard, and they're Irish, if they're in America or London or wherever. So I think it will come through, that level of education over the last 20 years, the opportunities they had, and they grabbed, you know, they absolutely, you know, jumped at every opportunity. I think we're going to see the results of that, maybe not in Afghanistan because they're not allowed to do it. And as I say, maybe the best, the brightest have left. I'm not saying the best and the brightest aren't also there, but they're not going to have the same opportunities. But I think we're going to hear the results and see the results of Afghanistan, creativity, imagination, you know, in the diaspora as well. Films, there's great filmmakers.
Any other thoughts or reflections on that? The interaction between Western photojournalism, Afghan photojournalism?
I'm not speaking of it. I'm not really that knowledgeable about it in the sense of not connected. I had run into, I forget his name, but there was a famous Afghan photographer that was there and was helping Western photographers. I forget his name, but this is the importance, and I think it's also what we're trying to do at Seven. We're trying to help photographers in different regions around the world to develop their own photojournalistic communities to document their societies from their perspective. And Afghanistan is no different.
Yeah. Well, great. We've been going for quite some time, but I think that's been warranted because of the topic, the work that you've shown, the questions we've had. So I think it's time to draw to a close. Ron, Chris, Daniel, Seamus, want to thank you very much for participating, sharing your work. I want to thank the audience who have stayed with us now for nearly an hour and 3/4, which is absolutely amazing. Thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you at another event soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming, people.